Hey there, and welcome to Botanic Haven, the little corner of the internet where we talk about gardening, plant care, and turning tiny balconies or big backyards into green, cozy places you actually want to spend time in. Today, I want to share something that sounds completely wrong at first, almost like gardening misbehavior, but weirdly enough, it works better than the proper way you see in most manuals. I'm talking about planting methods that break the rules on paper but give you stronger roots, tougher plants, and fewer disappointments. This isn't theory, it's the kind of thing you discover after killing enough plants to finally start listening to what they're trying to tell you, not just what the label says. I still remember one spring when my friend Daisy came to me almost in tears, holding a tray of sad, floppy tomato seedlings. She had done everything right according to the instructions, planted them at the correct depth, spaced them as recommended, added fertilizer for tomatoes, and even talked to them, which is always a bonus in my book. Still, the plants were thin, pale, and just refusing to grow. It was one of those moments when you realize you can either keep being polite and follow the rules, or you can say, okay, this isn't working. Let's do something that looks totally wrong. So we did the wrong thing, on purpose. Instead of planting the tomatoes upright in the center of the hole, as everyone says you should, I showed Daisy how to plant them almost lying down, in a deep trench with only the top leaves sticking out. We gently stripped the lower leaves, bent the stems sideways, and buried most of each plant horizontally. She stared at me like I had just buried her plants alive. To be fair, it does look like you're trying to hide the evidence of a gardening crime. But here's the trick. Tomatoes grow roots all along their stems, so the more stem you bury, the bigger and stronger the root system becomes. This wrong method gives you a tough, drought-resistant plant that eats poor soil for breakfast. A few weeks later, Daisy's dead tomatoes were the biggest, happiest plants on the block. I've noticed that a lot of the so-called right methods are designed to sound simple, clean, and universal, but real soil, real weather, and real balconies don't care about textbook rules. The wrong methods are often just more realistic. They accept that your ground might be heavy clay, your windowsill might be shady, or your schedule might be chaotic. When you stop trying to look like a perfect gardener and instead start trying to understand how roots behave, how soil breathes, and how plants actually respond to stress, you naturally drift toward methods that would probably make a gardening textbook editor very uncomfortable. And yet, your plants look better. People often ask me, but how do I know if these strange tricks are actually working for my garden? My answer is always to test on a small scale, compare and watch the plants. Also, I really like to collect feedback from you because your climate, soil and pots are different from mine. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments, and if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. It sounds silly, but these tiny numbers tell me a lot about what works in real homes and yards, not just on paper. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain wrong methods keep winning no matter where you are. One of my favorite wrong ideas is planting too deep and too crowded at the beginning, then fixing it later. Garden books love to repeat the phrase, right plant, right place, right spacing, like a holy mantra. And sure, long-term plants do need their space. But if you've ever started seeds indoors, you know that tiny seedlings don't follow social distancing rules. My friend Lucas, for example, would carefully sow only 1 seed in each cell of his seed tray, exactly as the label commanded. Half of them wouldn't germinate, a few would rot, and he'd be left with sad gaps. Meanwhile, I would sprinkle way too many seeds into each cell, almost like salting my food, and let a mini forest appear. Lucas joked that my method looked like throwing a party without counting how many people fit in the room. And in a way, he was right. But here's the difference. After the seedlings sprouted, I chose the strongest ones and gently snipped the weaker ones at the base, leaving only 1 or 2 per spot. It felt brutal, almost cruel, but the end result was trays full of sturdy plants instead of half-empty grids. The correct method wasted space, time, and packets of seeds. The wrong method embraced chaos at first and then brought order later, when it was clear who the real survivors were. A similar thing happens outdoors with direct sowing in the garden. You're supposed to carefully space carrot or beet seeds in perfect lines, but those seeds are tiny and your hands are human. So people end up either sowing too few and getting patchy rows, or too many and having to thin aggressively. I say, lean into it. Sow more thickly than you think you should, especially if your soil is unpredictable, then thin in stages. At each step, you leave the strongest, best-positioned plants, and you can even eat the tiny thinnings as microgreens. Is it textbook perfect spacing from the start? Not at all. But it respects the fact that not every seed will germinate, not every seedling will thrive, and you don't know which ones are the winners until you see them in action. Another wrong move that secretly works is not babying your seedlings too much indoors. New gardeners often keep their little plants in a warm, windless, cozy environment for far too long. They're afraid of the cold, the sun, the wind, and basically life itself. I once visited Oliver, who had turned his living room into a seedling spa. The lights were always low and gentle, there was no airflow, and the temperature barely changed. His seedlings looked perfect at a glance, tall, green, stretching up to the light, but when he tried to plant them outside, they collapsed at the first real breeze. When I asked how he had hardened them off, he looked at me like I was speaking another language. The right way, if you read instructions, often sounds stiff. Place outdoors for 1 hour, then 2 hours, increase daily, and so on. Most people either forget or get confused and end up skipping steps. My wrong approach is rougher, but more forgiving. I start earlier, and I let my seedlings experience stress in small, irregular doses. A slightly open window on a cool day, a fan blowing gently on them inside, a few hours outside on a cloudy afternoon. Then back in. Not perfectly timed, not perfectly measured, just regularly uncomfortable in small ways. It sounds mean, but plants are like people. A little controlled stress builds resilience. The key is to watch them, not the clock. If the leaves droop badly or crinkle, I dial it back. If they look fine, I push a bit more the next time. By the time these seedlings finally move outside for good, the wind doesn't scare them, the sun doesn't burn them nearly as much, and temperature swings don't leave them in shock. On paper, my method probably looks wrong because it doesn't follow a strict schedule. In reality, it mirrors natural conditions more closely than an overly strict routine does. Let's talk about soil for a moment, because this is where people get the most confused by the clash between right and wrong. Traditional advice often makes you feel like you need exactly the right type of soil mixture for each plant, as if your garden is a laboratory. You read phrases like well-draining yet moisture-retentive loam, and wonder if you should just move into a botanical garden instead of using the dirt you already have. My friend Rose once spent a small fortune on premium potting mixes, special amendments and fertilizers. She mixed them according to fancy diagrams she found online, layering things so carefully it looked like a dessert in a glass. You know what happened? The plants sulked, some roots rotted, and others dried out. The problem wasn't the quality of the ingredients, but the idea that soil has to be perfectly engineered instead of gradually improved. The wrong method that ended up working for Rose was embarrassingly simple. She stopped over-mixing and over-amending all at once. Instead, she added compost slowly over time, mulched with organic material, and trusted worms and microorganisms to do the blending for her. She scratched in a little compost near the top, watered well, and let the system evolve. This slower, messier approach looks unprofessional if you're used to neat recipes. But soil life doesn't want a sudden shock of new ingredients thrown at it. It wants a steady diet, like a stomach that adjusts to better food over months, not one giant feast that causes problems. The right method made Rose feel in control but created instability below the surface. The wrong method gave control back to the soil life, and her plants responded by growing deeper roots and richer foliage. Her garden transformed not overnight, but bit by bit, in a way that actually lasted. Now let's move on to watering, because this is where almost everyone gets tangled up. The right way, according to many labels, is to water regularly, keep the soil evenly moist, and never let it dry out. Sounds safe, doesn't it? In reality, constantly moist soil often becomes a swamp for roots, especially in pots without perfect drainage. Ivy, a friend of mine with a gorgeous collection of potted plants, once told me proudly that she watered a little every day, like a ritual. Her plants looked fine at first, then gradually started to droop, yellow, and attract fungus gnats. When I lifted her pots, they felt heavy, almost soggy. The roots were sitting in damp soil that never had a chance to breathe. I suggested what sounded like a very wrong approach. Water less often, but more thoroughly, and then let the top few centimeters of soil dry out before watering again. Deep watering encourages the roots to go down in search of moisture instead of staying shallow. Allowing the surface to dry slightly signals to the plant that it's time to stretch its roots and toughen up, not to sit at the surface waiting for another shallow drink. It felt unnatural to Ivy at first. Skipping a watering day made her nervous, like she was neglecting her plants. But slowly she noticed something. The plants stopped drooping, the soil smelled fresher, and the gnats moved on to bother someone else. The wrong method taught her to think in cycles rather than routines. Soak, drain, rest, repeat. The plants didn't want a constant sip. They wanted a full drink, and then a break. It was less about strict timing and more about paying attention to how the soil and leaves looked and felt. Transplanting is another place where a little bit of wrong can be very right. You're often told to disturb the roots as little as possible when moving a plant to a bigger pot or into the ground. Handle gently. Keep the root ball intact, the advice says. That sounds kind, but if a plant has been sitting in the same pot for too long, its roots often circle around and around, forming a dense knot. Plant that tight knot as is, and the roots might keep circling instead of exploring the new soil, like a pet that never leaves its cage even when you open the door. My method with root-bound plants looks rude, but it works. I take the root ball out, then gently tease the roots apart with my fingers, loosening the outer layer. If the roots are extremely dense, I even make a few vertical cuts with a clean knife or scissors on the sides of the root ball. It feels like I'm doing something terrible, cutting into those white strands. But what happens next is magical. The plant responds by sending out new roots from those cut areas, reaching into the surrounding soil instead of staying in a tight coil. I did this once with a sad-looking rosemary that Oliver had bought from a store and kept in its original pot for too long. When we finally freed it, the roots formed a solid spiral pattern. Oliver winced when he saw me slice the sides a bit, but within a few weeks, in its new, well-draining spot, the rosemary perked up, darkened in colour, and started producing new growth. The right method would have planted the solid root circle as is. The wrong method helped the plant finally realise it had more space and resources around it. Even timing can be flipped on its head. The official right time to plant many things is based on averages, calendars, and safe zones. But microclimates are real, and not all gardens warm up at the same pace. I know gardeners who always plant according to the recommended date on the seed packet, and then wonder why their seedlings stall or get eaten. Meanwhile, an older neighbour of mine who never reads labels plants when the soil feels ready and the wind doesn't bite anymore, as she puts it. Her garden usually beats the schedule by a week or two in some spots and lags in others. She plants by feel, not by rule. Her so-called wrong timing is actually hyper-local timing. She presses her hand into the soil, notices how it crumbles or clumps, watches how the shade moves during the day, feels the air at sunrise. It sounds mystical, but it's just attention. Over the years, she's discovered that her backyard warms up faster than her front yard, and that one raised bed near the wall acts like a mini greenhouse. So she plants warmth-loving crops earlier in that spot while waiting for the slower areas to catch up. If she followed the generalized right dates, she'd miss that advantage. Pruning is another area where rule-breaking works wonders. For many beginners, pruning feels like harming the plant. The right advice is often vague. Prune lightly, remove dead or diseased branches, and so on. But in practice, many plants respond incredibly well to what looks like a drastic haircut. For example, leggy herbs such as basil or mint often benefit from being cut back much more aggressively than feels comfortable. The first time I told Daisy to cut her basil plants down by about 1/3, she stared at the lush green leaves like I was asking her to cut her own hair before a party. But the science is simple. When you remove the top growth in a smart way, above a pair of leaves or nodes, you stimulate the plant to branch out, creating a bushier shape and more growing tips. The wrong instinct to leave the plant as full as possible often leads to tall, weak, and sparse growth. The wrong method of hurting it a little triggers a stronger response. A few weeks after Daisy's reluctant pruning session, her basil was not only back to its former size, but fuller, with more leaves she could harvest. It was a perfect example of how a scary action done thoughtfully produces a better result. Even with indoor houseplants, doing the opposite of what the label suggests can help. Many houseplant tags say things like bright indirect light, as if that's one precise setting you can choose. People read that and assume the plant is delicate, so they place it in a dark corner, away from any actual light, fearful of a few rays of sun. Then the plant slowly declines, dropping leaves and stretching toward the nearest window. The right advice was too vague. The wrong reaction was to overprotect. I often advise people to test their plants in brighter conditions than they think the plant can handle, moving it gradually closer to the window and observing. Sometimes that so-called low-light plant is actually happiest near a bright east window, catching fresh morning light that never burns it. The trick is to avoid sudden shocks, but to be brave about experimenting. A plant that grows tight, compact leaves, rich in colour, is often saying, "Thank you. This is much better," even if the tag would accuse you of giving it too much light. Fertilizing is another debate where common wisdom can mislead. You're told to feed your plants regularly with liquid fertilizer, especially in pots. So people set a schedule every week or every 2 weeks and stick to it like a strict diet plan. But plants are not calendar addicts. They respond to light, temperature, and growth phases. Feeding heavily during low-light seasons or when the plant is stressed can do more harm than good, leading to weak, soft growth that pests adore. My wrong fertilizing method is more like giving snacks during growth spurts, not constant meals year-round. I increase the feeding slightly when I see new leaves, fast growth, or after a pruning session, and I lighten up when growth slows or the days are short. I also favour gentle, diluted doses rather than strong, full-strength ones. On paper, it looks inconsistent. In practice, it respects the plant's rhythm instead of the human need to follow a neat schedule. The plants end up smaller on paper maybe, but stronger in reality, with fewer sudden crashes or pest explosions. Let's also talk about mulch, because here too the wrong way can be surprisingly right. Textbooks say mulch should be neat, uniform, and carefully kept a certain distance from stems. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. In real life, organic mulch, dry leaves, shredded bark, straw, moves around, breaks down and gets scratched into the soil by animals and insects. Instead of obsessively arranging it like a decorative carpet, I let it be a dynamic layer. Some gardeners panic when they see mulch touching the base of a plant, worried about rot. It can be a problem in some cases, especially with very moist conditions and sensitive stems, but often a bit of close mulch actually keeps soil temperatures more stable and encourages surface life. The wrong look of messy mulch, piled irregularly, is often better than the right look of a bare, clean soil surface that dries out quickly and erodes. Nature rarely leaves soil naked. That's more of a human design preference than a plant need. Then there's the question of mixing plants that shouldn't go together. Companion planting advice can sometimes be very rigid. This plant loves this one, this plant hates that one. While there is some truth in plant pairings, the reality is more flexible. Ivy once showed me a plan she found online with strict zones for each plant, all separated like students taking a test. She followed it exactly, and her garden looked organized but weirdly lifeless, with each plant isolated. Meanwhile, her neighbor had a messy bed where flowers, herbs, and vegetables mingled in what looked like chaos but buzzed with pollinators and beneficial insects. The wrong method of mixing plants by height, texture, and timing rather than strict compatibility lists can create healthier mini ecosystems. Tall plants can shade tender ones, low herbs can cover the soil and act as living mulch. Flowering companions can draw pollinators to fruiting crops. It's not about memorizing a compatibility chart, it's about watching how plants interact in your specific conditions. A bed that looks too crowded in a photo might feel just right in real life, with every niche filled and less room for weeds or pests to dominate. We also need to mention something important. Your mistakes are often better teachers than your successes. Follow the rules perfectly, and if something goes wrong, you might not even know why, because you never experimented. Try something wrong, like planting a bit earlier, deeper, or in a different spot, and you get feedback. You see how the plant reacts. Does it sulk, bounce back, or thrive? That response is gold. Over the years, you build your own rulebook for your garden, which might contradict half the advice you see online but works exactly where you live. Take Lucas again. He once decided against all good advice to plant sun-loving flowers in a spot that gets only morning light and a bit of filtered shade in the afternoon. On paper, that was a bad match, but that area of his yard had rich, cool soil that stayed moist just enough during heat waves. To his surprise, those flowers did better there than in his sunnier, drier bed. The combination of slightly less light but more stable moisture turned out to be their sweet spot. If he had stayed loyal to the strict rule of full sun or nothing, he would have never discovered that microclimate. The longer you garden, the more you realize that the wrong method that works is simply the right method for your specific context, just not yet blessed by a book. When you look at it this way, rule breaking stops feeling rebellious and starts feeling like a conversation with your plants. You try something, they answer. If they answer with yellow leaves and droopy stems, you adjust. If they answer with new growth and deeper color, you lean into that direction. The key is to change only one or two things at a time so you actually know what made the difference. And that brings us back to the idea of planting itself. Depth, spacing, angle, and timing. Planting deeper than recommended, especially with plants that can root along their stems like tomatoes or some perennials, gives them a stronger foundation. Planting at a slight angle rather than perfectly straight can actually help in windy areas, allowing the plant to anchor better. Planting closer at first and thinning later recognizes that nature always oversows, expecting losses. These things look wrong to someone used to neat diagrams, but they mirror how plants actually grow in the wild. So when you're out there in your garden or on your balcony and you're holding a seedling in your hand, remember that the instructions on the tag are just a starting point, not a law. You can bury a bit more stem, break up the root ball more than the label dares to suggest, water less often but more deeply, and mix plants that look like friends even if some guide says they're strangers. Your job is not to be a perfect student. Your job is to be an observant partner to your plants. Over time, you'll build a small personal collection of wrong methods that always work for you. Maybe you'll be the person who always plants tomatoes sideways in a trench, or the one who sprinkles seeds too thickly and then edits the crowd later, or the one who trusts messy mulch more than bare soil. And when someone asks, "Why do you do it that way?" you'll be able to say, "Because I tried it, and my plants liked it." That's really the only proof that matters. So go ahead, experiment a little. Plant something deeper than the packet says. Try a brighter window for that shade plant. Let the soil dry slightly before watering again. Chop back that herb more boldly than feels safe. Watch what happens. The garden will tell you very clearly what it prefers if you give it the chance. And who knows, your wrong way might become someone else's favorite gardening trick one day.